I kept the house. I kept the kids. I kept my mouth shut for 32 years because that's what you do when you're a father. You hold things together and you don't ask for a medal. My name is Frank. I'm 67 years old. I live in a two-story house in Barrie, Ontario, about 90 minutes north of Toronto, with a backyard that backs onto a creek and a garage that still smells like motor oil, even though I haven't touched an engine in years. I have 3 grandchildren. I raised them, not helped raise them, raised them. Their lunches, their doctor's appointments, their report cards, their nightmares at 2 in the morning, all of it. And then, one Tuesday in October, my own son showed up at my door with a woman I'd never met, and 2 men in suits, and told me that I had stolen those children's lives. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I'm not a complicated man. I worked 30 years as a site supervisor for a general contractor out of Simcoe County. I coached hockey for 12 seasons. I made my wife's favorite chicken soup every Sunday until she passed, and then I kept making it because the kids expected it. I don't have enemies. I don't have secrets. I just have a house, a truck with 200,000 kilometers on it, and 3 grandchildren who call me Grandpa Frank. Their names are Lily, Owen, and Nora. Lily is 21 now. Owen is 19. Nora just turned 17 in September, and she made me a birthday card last year with a drawing of the 2 of us ice fishing that I still have taped to the fridge. None of that happened by accident. It started in the winter, 18 years ago. My son. I'll call him my son throughout this because that's how I think of him still, even after everything, even now. He was 31, going through a rough patch that had turned into a rough year. His marriage was crumbling. There was drinking involved. There were other things involved that I won't go into except to say that his wife at the time, the children's mother, was in an even worse place than he was. Her name doesn't matter. What matters is what she did. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon. The kids were at school. She said she needed to drop some things off at my place, and could I be home around 4? I said, sure, I'll put the kettle on. She showed up at 4:15 with all 3 children, a garbage bag full of clothes, and a look on her face that I recognized from my own life. That flat, exhausted look of someone who has already made a decision and is just getting through the logistics. She handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, 2 paragraphs, barely that, saying she needed time to get herself sorted out, that the kids would be better off with me for a little while, that she'd be in touch. She kissed each of them on the forehead. She told Lily, who was 3 at the time, that Grandpa Frank made the best hot choppage in Ontario. Then she walked out to her car and drove away. That was the last any of us saw of her for 8 years. I won't pretend those first months were easy. Lily was 3, Owen was barely 2, and Nora was 6 months old. I was 51 years old, recently retired, and I'd been looking forward to fishing trips and quiet mornings and maybe finally cleaning out the garage. Instead, I was figuring out how to collapse a stroller one-handed while holding a baby and keeping track of a 2-year-old in a parking lot in January. In Barrie. In January. If you've ever done that, you know. My neighbour, a retired teacher named Pete, 64, widower, the kind of man who would shovel your driveway before you even knew it had snowed, Pete started showing up at 7:30 in the morning with coffee and no explanation. He'd sit at the kitchen table while I did the morning routine. He didn't ask questions. He just handed me the baby when my hands were full. After about 3 weeks of this, I asked him why he kept coming over, and he said, because you're not going to ask for help and somebody's got to be here anyway. Pete became my person in all of this. The kids called him Uncle Pete before the year was out. He was there for every Christmas morning, every first day of school, every hockey practice for Owen, every dance recital for Lily. He once drove 4 hours round trip in a February ice storm to pick up Nora from a school trip because I had a stomach bug and couldn't stand up without the room spinning. He never asked for anything in return. Never. My son, meanwhile, got himself together, slowly. It took a few years. Real recovery does, but he did it. Went back to school part-time, got his Red Seal certification as an electrician, met a woman I'll call my daughter-in-law who was steady and kind and seemed to genuinely love him. He was around. He visited the kids, took them for weekends sometimes, helped with costs when he could. We never had a formal arrangement, no lawyers, no court orders, just an understanding. His children were safe. They were loved. That was what mattered. He never said much about their mother. When the kids asked, and they did, especially Lily as she got older, he'd say she was somewhere getting better, that she loved them in her way, that some people needed a long time to find their footing. I thought that was generous of him. I still do. But the years passed. 8 of them. And then she came back. I didn't know she was back in Ontario until my son called me on a Sunday evening and said she'd reached out to him. She was clean, he said. Had been for 3 years. She was living in Guelph, had a job, had a lawyer. She wanted to reconnect with the children. I said that was between him and her and, most importantly, between them and the kids. Lily was 11 by then, Owen was 10, Nora was 8, old enough to have opinions, old enough to feel things that don't go away. I should have listened more carefully to what he wasn't saying on that phone call. He brought her to my house 2 weeks later. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table she'd left those kids at 8 years before, and she was different. Quieter, thinner. She had the look of someone carrying something heavy that they'd learned to balance. She cried a little. She said she was sorry. She said she knew sorry wasn't enough. I told her I agreed, but that what mattered now was the children, and that rebuilding a relationship with them would take time and patience and zero pressure. She said she understood. My daughter-in-law, my son's wife, was polite during that meeting, careful. She asked thoughtful questions. Afterward, when they'd left, I told Pete about the visit. He listened, refilled his coffee, and said, "Watch your back, Frank." I told him he was being paranoid. I was wrong. Over the next several months, things shifted in ways I couldn't quite name. My son started calling less. When he did call, there was a stiffness to him, a formality that hadn't been there before. My daughter-in-law, who had always been warm with me, became distant. When the kids came back from weekend visits, Lily especially seemed unsettled, not unhappy exactly, but like she'd been told something she was trying to process. I asked her once gently if anything was bothering her. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Dad says you never tried to find Mom. Is that true?" I told her the truth. I said I'd tried twice through a social worker at the Family Services office in Barrie, and both times the trail went cold. I had documentation, I had the dates. I'd even filed with the court for temporary guardianship 18 months after she left, so that I could legally enroll the kids in school and authorize medical decisions. Lily nodded slowly. But I could see that a seed had been planted. By the following spring, the calls from my son had stopped almost entirely. My daughter-in-law stopped returning texts. Then, on a Thursday morning in April, I opened my front door to find a process server standing on my porch. The documents he handed me said that I had unlawfully withheld the children from their parents, that I had interfered with parental rights, that I had manipulated the children emotionally to maintain control over them, and that the children's mother and father were jointly seeking full custody, and were recommending a formal family court investigation into my conduct. I stood there in my doorway, in my socks, holding these papers, and I couldn't find a single word. I called Pete. He was there in 7 minutes. He read through everything at my kitchen table while I sat across from him with my hands wrapped around a coffee mug I wasn't drinking from. When he finished, he looked up and said, "This is garbage, Frank, but garbage can still bury you if there's enough of it." He wasn't wrong. The process had already begun. A social worker from the Children's Aid Society showed up 2 days later to do an initial interview. She was professional, not unfriendly, but the questions she asked were pointed. Had I ever prevented the parents from seeing the children? Had I made negative comments about the children's mother in front of them? Had I used money as a means of control? I answered every question honestly. I had nothing to hide. But I was 63 years old and I was being asked to justify 18 years of my life in a 90-minute interview in my own living room. What gutted me was Lily. She was called to speak to the same social worker separately at school. I found out later, weeks later, that she'd been told by her mother that I had kept a letter from her. A letter that her mother claimed to have sent years ago, expressing her desire to reconnect. that I had supposedly intercepted and destroyed. There was no such letter. There had never been such a letter, but Lily didn't know that. She was 19 by then, old enough to be angry, young enough to be manipulated by someone she desperately wanted to believe in. She stopped coming home. Owen and Nora were different. Owen was quiet about it. He went along with the visits because he felt he had to, but he never moved out, never stopped coming to dinner on Sundays. And Nora, my Nora, who had been 6 months old when she arrived in a garbage bag's worth of belongings on my porch, she came to me one evening while I was in the garage pretending to organize tools I had no intention of organizing, and she said, "Grandpa Frank, I remember everything. And I'm not going anywhere." She was 17 years old. I had to turn away so she wouldn't see me lose it completely. The court proceedings began in June. My son had retained a family lawyer out of Toronto. Expensive, aggressive, the kind who sends 12-page letters in response to phone calls. I had a local lawyer named Deborah who worked out of a strip mall on Dunlop Street and who I trusted completely because she had handled my wife's estate 10 years earlier and hadn't charged me for half of what she could have. Deborah told me straight, "They're going to make this about the money, Frank. There's an estate involved. Your late wife's property. They know what the house is worth." I hadn't even thought about the house. I'd been so consumed by the custody narrative that I'd missed the financial one running underneath it. My wife had left me the house, a small RRSP, and a life insurance policy. Between the property value and the investments, we were talking somewhere in the range of $800,000. Not a fortune, but not nothing either. And I had always assumed, had told the kids more than once, that whatever I had would be split among Lily, Owen, and Nora. Their mother had a lawyer. Their father had a lawyer. And somewhere in those conversations, someone had done the math. The first court date was brutal. I sat in a room in the Barrie courthouse while my son, who I had covered for and believed in and helped rebuild from the ground up, sat across the courtroom and didn't meet my eyes. His wife held his hand. His wife's expression was the only one in that room I couldn't read. I looked at her twice during the proceedings, and both times she looked away first. The mother's lawyer argued that I had created an unhealthy dependency in the children, that my refusal to facilitate parental contact over the years had been systematic and deliberate, and that the existing informal arrangement had no legal standing and should never have been allowed to persist. Deborah was quiet and precise in her response. She entered my guardianship application from 18 years earlier, the school enrollment records, the medical authorization forms, the social worker contacts. She entered Pete's affidavit, 17 pages, single-spaced, covering 18 years of witnessed daily life in that house. The judge read it in silence for a long time. But the other side had something I wasn't expecting. They had a neighbour, a man who'd lived 2 doors down from me for 6 years before moving to Sudbury, who submitted a statement claiming I had made disparaging comments about the children's mother in his presence, and had on one occasion stated that I would, quote, "do whatever it took to keep those kids from being taken from me." I had no memory of saying that, but I also couldn't say with certainty that I hadn't, because after years of uncertainty and bureaucracy and being a 60-something man trying to keep 3 children safe with no support structure and no legal clarity, I probably had said something like that, not as a threat, as a vow. The judge recessed for 2 weeks. I went home and I sat in the kitchen, and I didn't touch my wife's recipe for the chicken soup because I didn't feel like I deserved it. Pete came over every morning. He brought groceries. He watched hockey games with me that neither of us paid attention to. One evening he said, "I need to tell you something." When I filed my affidavit, my lawyer suggested I include something, but I held it back because I wanted to ask you first. I told him to say it. He'd saved something. Years ago, 9 years, almost exactly, the children's mother had sent a letter to Pete's address. Not mine, his. She had apparently believed, or claimed to believe, that she and Pete had a more neutral relationship and that I wouldn't intercept something addressed to him. The letter was addressed to the children but had been sent to his house. Pete had never delivered it. Because the letter wasn't what it appeared to be, it wasn't a mother reaching out to her children. It was a 4-page legal threat, drafted with clear legal guidance. stating that she intended to resume custody of the children and warning that any resistance would result in criminal and civil action. It named me specifically. It had been prepared, Pete said, at a time when she had clearly not been clean. There were references in it that confirmed it, and the handwriting deteriorated badly by the 4th page. He had kept it in a fireproof box in his basement, along with the envelope showing his address and her return address and the postmark. He had never shown it to me because he hadn't wanted me to spend 9 years afraid. I told him that was the most complicated act of friendship I had ever encountered. He said, "I know. I'm sorry, but I think you need it now." He was right. Deborah submitted the letter and the original envelope to the court. The postmark dated it precisely. The contents contradicted in specific terms the narrative that the children's mother had been attempting for years to reconnect and been blocked at every turn. The letter was not a mother reaching out. It was a warning shot filed away until the moment felt right. The children's mother's lawyer objected. The judge listened to the objection and then looked at the envelope for a long time. "Was this letter ever delivered to its intended recipients?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor," Deborah said. "And the reason it was not delivered? Because the recipient, my client's neighbor and long-term family friend, assessed its contents and determined it would cause unnecessary distress and potential harm to the children, given their ages at the time." The judge asked no more questions. He made a note. The verdict came 3 weeks later. The judge found no evidence of wrongful interference with parental rights. He found clear and consistent evidence of a stable, nurturing, caregiving environment maintained over 18 years. He noted the guardianship filing, the documented attempts to locate the children's mother through social services, and the extensive affidavit testimony from community members, teachers, a family physician, and a hockey coach who had known Owen since he was 7. He also noted, with what I can only describe as restrained judicial language, that the timing and content of the 2015 letter suggested the custody application had motivations that extended beyond the welfare of the children. The application was dismissed. My son's lawyer filed a notice of appeal within the week. I don't know what happened in the conversations between my son and his wife in the weeks after that. I don't know what she said to him, or what he finally allowed himself to think about clearly without her sitting next to him. But 6 weeks after the verdict, he called me on a Sunday evening. I almost didn't answer. He said, "Dad, just that." And something in the way he said it told me that the conversation his wife and the other lawyers and the mother of his children had been having for the past 2 years had not been the same conversation he was finally having now. We talked for 2 hours. I won't put all of it here because some of it is his to keep, but I'll tell you that he said he was sorry, that he said he didn't understand what he'd let himself be part of until it was already done, that he said he was ashamed, and that he asked me, very quietly, if there was any way back. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would have said. I thought about the fact that this man had been 23 years old when things fell apart, that recovery is real and also imperfect, and that people who love each other badly are still people who love each other. I said, "Come for dinner Sunday, bring Owen." He said, "What about Lily?" I said, "Lily will come when she's ready, don't push her." He came for dinner. Owen was already there, he'd never left, not really. Nora made the chicken soup which she'd learned to make by watching me, which I had learned by watching her grandmother, which is how things are supposed to work. The appeal was withdrawn 2 months later. Lily took another 8 months. She showed up one afternoon unannounced, stood in my doorway and said, "I need to know the truth about everything, all of it, from the beginning." I said, "Come in, I'll put the kettle on." We talked for 6 hours. I showed her the court documents. I showed her the original guardianship filing from 18 years ago. I showed her the social worker contacts. I did not show her the letter. That felt like something she didn't need to carry. But I told her it existed, and I told her what it said, and I told her that Pete had kept it not to protect himself, but to protect her from knowing, at 8 or 12 or 14 years old, that her mother's first move back into her life had been a legal threat. She cried. I cried. We ate the leftover soup Nora had left in the fridge. Before she left, she stood at the door and said, "I'm sorry, I believed her over you. I told her I understood." that she had wanted a mother, that there is nothing wrong with wanting your mother, that I would have given anything to have been wrong about all of this. Pete had a small stroke in the spring. He's doing well now. Talking, moving, cantankerous as ever. I drove him to his cardiac rehab appointments for 3 months, and he complained the entire time about the parking at Royal Victoria. When he was discharged, I told him that I was going to pay for the bathroom renovation he'd been putting off for 2 years because his tub was not safe and I was not going to lose him to a bathtub. He said, "You don't have to do that." I said, "I know. That's why I'm doing it." The house is louder now than it's been in years. Lily brings her boyfriend sometimes, a quiet young man from Orangeville who seems genuinely baffled by how loud our Sunday dinners are. Owen got his apprenticeship certification last fall, following his father into the trades, which made my son cry in a way I pretended not to notice. Nora is applying to nursing programs in Ontario, and she's going to get in, because she has never in her life not done a thing she decided to do. Their mother is still in Guelph. There is contact, careful, limited, on the children's terms. I have no feelings about that except that it belongs to them and not to me. My son and I talk on the phone most weeks. It's different than it was before all of this. Something was broken and was put back together, and you can always feel the repair, but that doesn't mean it doesn't hold. My daughter-in-law has never spoken to me directly about her role in what happened. She is polite at dinners. I am polite back. Some things will take longer than others. What I know is this: I never stole those children. I caught them. There is a difference, and I have spent 18 years living it, and I would do every single day of it again. Last Sunday, Nora finished the soup, set the pot on the table, looked at all of us crowded into that kitchen. Her father, her brother, her sister, Pete's empty chair because he was tired and went home early, and she said, "We okay?" I said, "We're okay." And we were. I think about the night Pete handed me that letter, 9 years old, sitting in a fireproof box in his basement while I was right next door, not knowing it existed. He kept it to protect me, to protect Lily and Owen and Nora, and I used to think that was the strangest part of the whole story. Now, I think it might be the truest part. There's a version of this that ends badly, where I didn't file for guardianship in year 2, where I didn't keep every document, every school record, every date and receipt from the Family Services Office, where Pete decided that letter wasn't his problem and threw it out, where I got angry in that courtroom instead of quiet. Any one of those things, and the story ends differently. I've thought about that a lot. The bad outcome was never far away. It was right there the whole time, just waiting for me to make one careless move. What I've come to understand, and this took me longer than I'd like to admit, is that doing the right thing is not the same as being protected from consequences. I did the right thing for 18 years. I still ended up in a courthouse in Barrie being asked to justify my life. Doing right doesn't build a wall around you. What it does eventually is build a record. And a record is harder to argue with than a feeling. That's what I'd tell anyone in a situation like mine. Keep the paper, keep the dates, keep the receipts and the letters and the names of every social worker you ever spoke to. Not because you're building a case, you shouldn't have to build a case for loving children in your care, but because the truth needs somewhere to live. It needs to be written down somewhere outside your own memory, somewhere a judge can hold it in his hands. And then there's my son. I could have stayed angry. There's a version of me, not so different from the man I actually am, who closes the door on that Sunday phone call and never opens it again. Pride makes that easy. Pride makes a lot of things easy in the short term. But I have watched what pride costs people over the long run, and the price is too high. He made serious mistakes. He let himself be led into something that I believe, on some level, he knew was wrong. And then he found his way back. I think that took more courage than anything I did, actually. It is harder to come back than to go. Nora still makes the soup. She gets the seasoning slightly wrong, a little too much thyme. And I have never once told her that, because it wouldn't matter. What matters is that she learned it. What matters is that Owen is doing his apprenticeship and Lily brought that quiet young man from Orangeville to Sunday dinner, and Pete's bathroom is now safe, and the kitchen is loud again. I don't know what I believe about how the world works, exactly. But I know what I've seen, that patience outlasts anger, that honesty outlasts a well-constructed lie, and that the people who stay, who show up in January, who keep the letter, who don't leave when things get ugly, those are the ones who matter in the end. Pete mattered. My lawyer Deborah mattered. The hockey coach who wrote 3 pages about Owen's character mattered. You build a life out of the people who stay. Everything else sorts itself out eventually.